I'm excited to join you all today. My name is Charlie Stott, co-chair of AIA San Francisco's Committee on the Environment, and I'm excited today about taking a deep dive into the world of experiential design schemas with authors Gail Brager and Mark DeKay in conversation with architect Bob Harris. This morning's event is due to the efforts of a number of folks, two of which I'd love to thank right now. First is Kira Gould, who is on this call and who you'll meet in a moment. Kira has developed a book series called COTE Books, and this event is the second in that series. Kira's efforts and energies are exceptional, working as a strategist, author, Design the Future podcast co-host, AIA National COTE leader, Architecture 2030 fellow, and so much more. She's a true leader in the environmental cause. Thank you, Kira. I also want to thank our local host for the event, AIA San Francisco, and especially Annabelle Udo O'Malley, who provides unwavering support and guidance in our efforts at AIASF. As chair of the Committee on the Environment, also known as COTE, I'd like to say a few words about who we are and what we do here at AIA San Francisco. The Committee on the Environment is 700 members strong, drawn from the design, engineering, construction, and advocacy community. We hold monthly meetings and various presentations and events focused on environmental and climate design topics. Go to AIASF.org for more info. Before handing off to Kira Gould for introductions, I'd like to pause for a moment just to consider something Bob Harris with Lake Slato Architects wrote in his review of the book we'll hear about today. He said, "This book is not about providing set answers or solutions, but rather opening a field of possibilities to highlight, quote, human experiences set in a context of both natural forces and spatial order." It's that field of possibilities that COTE is excited to embrace in our quest to bring design awareness and improvements to an environmentally stressed world. Today's conversation should inspire us all to open our eyes to that field of possibilities. Take it away, Kira, and thank you everyone for being here today.
Thank you, Charlie. That was beautiful. What a wonderful way to start. As Charlie mentioned, this is the beginning of a series. We're actually in the pilot phase. This is our second ever COTE book talk, and I'm really delighted to see the interest and the attendance of it. So thank you so much for being here. The way we do this is that we run reviews. We've always run reviews of books in COTE News. But I've been thinking lately that it would be interesting to sort of segue those into a more engaged conversation around those books. And so this is our second, as we mentioned, and I'm just absolutely delighted to have you all here today. This book is, as mentioned, Experiential Design Schemas by Mark DeKay and Gail Brager, who I'll introduce in a moment. We really want to especially thank ORO Editions, their publisher, for supporting this session today. We really appreciate that. And also very much appreciate Bob Harris of Lake Slato, who Charlie just quoted, who reviewed the book for COTE News and is with us today to pose some questions to Mark and Gail. But let me just first give a very brief introduction to Mark and Gail, and then I will let them take it away. Mark DeKay is an architect and full professor of architecture at the University of Tennessee, and he specializes in sustainable design theory, research, and design tools. Gail Brager is a building scientist and distinguished professor of architecture in the Building Science, Technology, and Sustainability program at the University of California, Berkeley. There are many more things I could say about both of them, including other publications and other work that they do, but I want you to hear from them more than from me. So I would like to move right out of this, and I'm going to stop sharing and invite them to join and get us started.
Great. Well, thank you. Can everybody see my screen?
Yeah, Annabelle, I think you have to start my video there. Thank you.
So, hello, everybody. Thank you, Kira, for inviting us, and thank you to all of our listeners for being here. We are so excited to share the story of our new book, which is essentially about how to enrich the human experience of architecture and is aimed at bridging the data-driven language of building science and engineering with a more poetic sensorial perspective of the architect. So we'll begin by sharing a bit of our own story about how we got to this place. Some of you might be familiar with my research group, the Center for the Built Environment, and I imagine that some of you on the call are our partners. Thank you for your support. We have spent decades conducting research on building energy use, indoor environmental quality, and human response, and impacting the building industry through development of tools and technologies and contributing to building standards and green building rating systems. So while our signature has always been to link energy performance with human response, I've always felt that something was still missing and that we were relying too heavily on conventional methods of assessing comfort and missing vital, more nuanced descriptions of what it means to create soulful architectural experiences and how nature plays a big part of that.
And since 1996, I've been working on 2 editions of this book, Sun, Wind, and Light. It's now 2 volumes, over 800 pages. And we were looking at here over a couple of decades, looking at architectural space and form and how it influenced energy use. So it's a very architectural approach to performance, particularly in preliminary design. But I began to realize, of course, there's no feeling in kilowatt hours, no feeling in BTUs. So I kept wondering, wasn't there some kind of human side to saving energy? And then about 2004, I began to look for other approaches for how to design with nature. And this took several years and resulted in another work that we call Integral Sustainable Design. And in that book, we developed 16 different viewpoints about sustainable design. And one of those, one of its 4 major approaches was the experience of sustainable design. And at that point, we began to see that how sustainable design feels is as important as how it works. You need both of those. But until now, really, that idea for us remained undeveloped in practical terms. So in addition to our own personal journeys, there are 2 things, at least 2 things that Gail and I share that motivated our desire to create this book. First, we both have a profound love of nature, and our belief is that nature experiences are important as a part of environmental stewardship. If people experience the wonders of nature, they're more likely to care about it, to take some spontaneous action, and hopefully to do more to protect the planet. This connection to nature, it needs to happen, we believe, in both the outdoors and our indoor lives. Because, people, when they experience the joys of nature from indoors, hopefully they take more care for those buildings that are a part of creating those experiences where we spend most of our time. And related to this, we believe that climate responsive buildings are also key to creating places that are healthy for both the planet and people. They're not only really helpful for saving energy, but also connect people to the sensory qualities of the natural environment that have the potential to bring us joy, the light, sound, smells, thermal experiences. So both of these goals have been important, an important part of our passion for teaching and research over several decades. And this book also springs from that as well. This work in the new work here is about how architecture can bridge between the dynamic rhythms of nature and our indoor experiences. Now, as co-authors, we come from very different backgrounds, and we join forces under our common curiosity concerning this crazy elusive idea of human experience. We wanted to know more about how do people experience nature in buildings and in cities, and then how does one design sensory environments to create uplifting architectural experiences. And we love the way that in this example here, Adlin Darling, they use intentions about human experience as the starting point for much of their work. And here's just an example. Here's what they say about this Wendover Contemplative Center. They said, it was designed to promote personal renewal and well-being, where the landscape and the architecture integrates to replenish and invigorate the spirit.
So in exploring how we can contribute to creating uplifting human experiences, we framed 5 interrelated pieces of this puzzle. And we thought about them in terms of how we can move from what we call conventional realities, so problems that are found in practice, but please note that these start with good intentions, but we find that they often contribute to the conventional dullness of contemporary life experience. And then for each of these, we framed a parallel transformation of what we think of as richer experiential possibilities, where design can create greater pleasure and appreciation for nature. So in brief, we describe these conventional realities as, first, what we call the neutrality fallacy, where sensory neutrality is seen as the ideal, and success is achieved simply if no one complains or even notices the sensory environment. And this reality that people are becoming progressively disconnected from nature is expounded on by this idea that we're spending increasing amounts of our time indoors. And this is being contributed to by what we call the conditioning monarchy, where centralized lighting and HVAC systems rule, right? And occupants have very few abilities to control their interior environments. Now, all of this has led to occupants becoming increasingly addicted to air conditioning. And year by year, our tolerance to live without it decreases. And unfortunately, all of these realities are supported by the prevalence of universal standards, where the underlying assumption that we're all the same ends up actually making a significant percentage of us unhappy. Oops. Sorry, hold on a sec. But all of these realities, we believe, can be transformed to aspirational design commitments and new experiential possibilities. So instead of neutrality, vitality could be an experiential target, a goal. And far from isolating us from nature, buildings can reconnect us and establish our affinity with nature. Or monarchies of control systems can be transformed more toward a democracy of control that empowers individual agency and adaptive opportunity. And air conditioning is needed, but it should be used only when and where it's absolutely necessary, and augmented or eliminated entirely. And instead, we should be able to experience a healthy delight of diverse gourmet thermal experiences. And standards, they could hopefully be transformed from universal to promoting differential flexibility that adapts to cultural and regional diversity. So what do we mean by experience? It's really a hard concept to pin down. It's hard to talk about. It's hard to find the right language. And so this book spends quite a bit of time talking about this, far beyond what we have time to cover today. But we just want to offer a brief introduction to some of the ways we try to provide a language for talking about experience. So we look both at theory and also the science of how we experience environmental conditions, even while knowing that the science is going to give us only a part of the story, but that's where I like to nerd out. Many human experiences of the environment start with sensation. So we have stimuli from the environment. They're first processed by our sensory receptors, which then send signals to particular brain regions. And this initial response, it might be purely physiological, registering as a sensation, such as hot, cold, or loud, quiet. But designers are likely more interested in perception, right? How do people feel about those sensations? Are they annoying or pleasurable, negative or positive? So this psychological or affective state of mind, perception, includes how the mind and body interpret that information processed by the senses. And perception is influenced by much more than the physical. It might depend on one's activities, behavior, expectations, purpose for being in an architectural space, and much broader sociocultural factors. So another way to think about perception is this reinterpretation of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So the bottom two levels are about reducing the negative, which are necessary as a starting point, but we would argue are not sufficient. They are also the basis for standards in the strong majority of building science research. So it's where a lot of focus goes. Using the thermal environment as an example, look at the lowest level. The goal here is simply to avoid heat and cold stress. And it's often the basis for occupational safety and health standards, or maybe guidelines for resilient buildings to be habitable when power outages occur during natural disasters. Now, our buildings are generally operated to meet the next level. One example is the ASHRAE thermal comfort zone that specifies conditions in which 80% of the occupants will find the conditions acceptable. Again, important, not necessarily very aspirational. So given that the abundance of research and standards address the bottom two layers, our book instead focuses only on enhancing the positive, the top two layers. And we argue that one of the keys to moving upward in this hierarchy is to create buildings that provide rich, variable, multisensory environments through a greater connection to nature. In the book, we provide a framework for how do we actually describe variability, both in terms of environmental conditions and also the experiential scales of a person. For example, environmental variability can be spatial, either when a particular room is non-uniform in light or sound, or maybe it's temporal, where the different sensory qualities in a space change over time. And we can feel this heat or coolness locally on different parts of our body, or we can feel them as a whole body experience, such as when conditions change or we move between different spaces.
I'd like to give you a high-level overview of the book before we dive into a few examples. On the cover here that you see on the left, we have Ando's meditation hall in the San Museum found in Korea, in which he describes this as a place to discover oneself. And it's a nice example of some variability that Gail's been talking about. The light comes in through this arc in a thin arch-shaped skylight. And over the course of the day, the angle of the light and the resulting ambiance that it creates are changing throughout the day. The table of contents that you see here on the right shows how the book is organized into 5 basic chapters. There's an introductory chapter that we call Beyond Comfort, sort of those moving to the aspirational levels that Gail was talking about. The second chapter uses integral theory from philosopher Ken Wilber as a framework for how to make sense out of the varieties of architectural experience, both subjective and objective, individual and collective. The third chapter we call Excited by Evidence, and I have to give a lot of credit to Gail for that one. And it briefly describes the science of our sensory systems, and there's a focus that we have on our response to environmental stimuli that are variable. The fourth chapter is really the heart of the book, and it's organized into 6 subsections that we'll describe in just a minute. But first, what is an experiential design schema? What do we mean by that? So in brief, we think of it as an organization of space and form that's orchestrating some environmental conditions in order to create a specific positive human experience. And we've developed 45 of these for this work, and each one is presented in this 4-page, 2-spread format. The first spread that you see on the top includes a description of the experience and a couple of elegant precedents of how other architects have employed this in practice. And the second spread has our related supporting evidence and, importantly, some design guidelines, with original drawings and diagrams that might be illustrating either one of those or both. And this was a kind of a discipline, right? To write inside of a fixed territory, limited space. And that was a really interesting experience because it forced us to choose over and over again what was most important. Now, you'll also see a set of navigational icons down the edge of the page. And the top set is identifying 6 different distributions of conditions. And these describe how the environmental elements that we experience are actually distributed in space and in time. So these are the elements of that variability. And we call these contrasts, which are sharp, adjacent distinctions of conditions, gradients, which can be smooth transitions from one condition to another, rhythms, such as the cycle of the day and cycle of the season, fluxes, which are more random or stochastic patterns, for example, the way lighting changes with the moving clouds. Sequences, where primarily we're moving from one space to another, one zone to another, where the experiences in each of those is different. And then finally, narratives, which require for their experience some sort of symbolic interpretations of a story in order to interpret what's going on. So in the book, we have these 45 schemas, and they're grouped first by these 6 categories of environmental variability. And you see those in the columns of this outline of all of the schemas. And then with each sort of inside of each one of those groups, we're addressing different scales. So each schema then is located in a primary scale that ranges from the smallest at the level of materials up to whole buildings. And then you might notice, if you can, I don't know if you can read all that on your screen, but that each one of these is coded for reference. For example, schema C2 is called haptic conditions, and the C is for contrast. It's a contrast schema at level 2, and level 2 is our scale for building elements. And this gives us kind of a system that organizes experiential design knowledge. And it's a system then that can be open-ended and continue to grow. We've worked with some really great photographers. We've got about 170 photos that are richly illustrating the experiences, and those experiences are represented across a wide range of scales and a wide range of building types and settings, from residential to public spaces, civic spaces, and some everyday spaces. And there's also about 130 original diagrams in the book. So the whole thing was done by our team: the book design, the layout, the illustrations. There's 3 basic types. The first one here, you can see, shows some conceptual ideas, some frameworks of thought. The second type presents the findings from research, from various kinds of evidence, that are then crafted and interpreted by us to communicate the essence of what's important about that research to architects. Then the third type is helping us to understand some design choices, or offer some design guidelines, or reveal some kind of typologies of variations inside of that schema. So the next thing we'll do is we'll take you on a short little tour of the schemas themselves.
So let's start with contrasts. The category, this distribution of conditions, contrasts are about opposing conditions that we can experience simultaneously or in rapid succession. So we can experience these locally on our bodies, such as through our skin, when we feel the delight of walking on a warm, radiant floor in a cooler room, or maybe with our eyes, when we enjoy the complexity of sun and shadow and dappled light. So in this example, which is related to a schema we call Engage the Rain, the preschool atrium has an operable roof. So when it's open during a rainstorm, it creates this abrupt contrast between the wet exposure in the courtyard and the dryness under the porch. And then when the storm subsides, a different contrast is created for children moving in and out of the grand puddle. So another example schema in this category is thermal enclave, which provides a subspace with conditions and atmosphere contrasting with a larger ambient space. It can be distinguished at various scales, such as a room, zone, or alcove, with conditions that are purposely warmer or cooler than the surrounding areas to create a special atmosphere of retreat. So Wright's Winslow House provides a great example in a cool climate where the cozy fireplace inglenook is opposite the formal entry. It's raised and narrowed. It's screened with an arcade for partial enclosure. It's flanked with cushioned benches and heat storing brick wraps on 3 sides and a lowered ceiling to amplify this physical, social, and psychological warmth. And this is an example of one of our many organizational design typology diagrams in the book. In this case, the top row shows examples for organizing warm enclaves in cool weather, and the bottom shows cool pockets for warm weather. And each of these are at different scales and based on architectural case studies.
This next distribution, called gradients, the gradients are relatively smooth transitions from one kind of condition to another. In this example, it's a schema that we call shades of brilliance. And what you see here is the Perez Art Museum in Florida. They create public verandas covered with this expansive pergola over the top. And so this roof is connecting a park on one side with views of the bay on the other side. And it results in this rich gradient from full sun to partial shade to full shade. And generally all this is inside of, one person's range of perception, one person's field. And this then allows the occupant, the visitor, to choose the situation that they prefer. The left image there that you can see is the northeast terrace. It's shown in the afternoon, mostly shaded. In the morning, there would be more sun coming into the terrace, and then the people could be free to move those chairs forward or back as they preferred. Another gradient schema we named after the Greek god of the gentlest west wind, Zephyr Spectrum. And this is about creating a range of pleasurable, breezy, and calm conditions that allow people adaptive choices, again, to move between different conditions or to modify them. This hospital in Singapore does this through a variety of courtyards and external walkways shown on the left, or as you see on the right with louvered walls and operable jalousie windows in the patient rooms in one of the wings. So it's a rare example of a naturally ventilated hospital. These examples of research evidence, and so, in each one of these, we're showing you kind of a diagrammatic or illustrative slide that goes with that follows on that second spread for the schema. And so these illustrate here on the left that the building occupants show desire for a greater sensation of breeze than we previously thought. Not only do people want air movement when it's warm, which you might expect, but even if they're thermally feeling neutral, they also want greater air movement, which means that people want to feel the air just simply because it's refreshing. The evidence graphic on the right shows that the pleasurable thermal experience of a breeze comes from more than just airspeed itself, and that people actually prefer airflow patterns that are more like the fluctuations of natural wind. They prefer this over, let's say, the predictable cycles of a fluctuating fan. And it turns out that constant air movement was actually the least desirable condition.
So the next distribution, rhythms, is about allowing occupants to experience nature's periodicity. And we know that connecting people to the natural daily and seasonal cycles of nature is an essential part of biophilic design, but it's been something that's really been lost in our lives as we spend more time indoors and in buildings that are sealed and mechanically conditioned. So these pictures from a home in Greece are connected to a dawn and dusk schema, which orients different rooms to the east and west, intentionally focusing occupants' attention on the light and color transitions around sunrise and sunset and their lunar equivalents, and also connecting occupants to sky and water views while either inside or on the terrace. We created this illustration to describe the relationship between the physical and experiential. Many of you know the natural dynamic rhythms of daylight include two primary patterns. That one, light intensity, gradually shifts from low in the early morning and higher as the day progresses and lower again in the evenings. But also color temperatures vary, being lower or warm red when the sun is rising and setting, and higher color temperatures or cool blue at noon. And these combined daily changes affect hormone production, suppressing melatonin and increasing serotonin during the midday, vice versa in the evening. And these have an effect on our alertness, our sleep-wake cycles, moods, and other biological functions. The schema circadian space follows these patterns of natural light by designing to keep people healthy and energized with a bright blue morning light and the warmer hued, subdued evening illuminance. And here's two examples at very different scales. The one on the left, the New York loft's light-colored surfaces and sheer privacy curtains bring daylight into this narrow side-lit apartment. At night, however, too much light coming in, perhaps from the street lights, can make sleep difficult. So instead of using heavier darkening window coverings, this design is a wonderful way to accommodate two people with different sleep habits. So the bed is enveloped in curtains of two layers, an opaque black inner side to block night light, plus a white reflective outer layer that helps lighten the living and dining zones. And on the right is an example at the commercial scale. The Federal Center building in South provides workstations facing this bright atrium and informal social spaces that project into the light, providing a high dose for breaks or collaboration. So during the winter, where days are short in this higher latitude, employees can still get most of their circadian stimulus while still at work. I apologize for this.
Thank you. Fluxes are continuously changing stochastic kinds of conditions that we perceive as more random or chaotic. So think about the leaves blowing in the wind or the changing intensity of a rainstorm, like I'm actually experiencing an intense one right now. This is what you see here is Kingo Kuma's water cherry house, and it illustrates a schema that we call water animated surfaces. And what happens there is the sunlight comes and reflects off of the surface of water that's been disturbed by the wind to then reflect and project in kind of dancing patterns on the walls and the ceilings. The schema melodic materials brings weather awareness to occupants by responding to the rain and the wind forces primarily, and then translating those patterns into sound. On the left is what's called the Wind Museum in Korea, and the wind itself is the exhibit. It has these wooden slats with small gaps between them where the wind can kind of howl or whisper depending on the intensity of the weather. On the right, in China, a rain hearing pavilion is designed for people to simply sit and to listen to the sounds of the rain as they fall on a tile roof, bounce off of the stone floor, or fill the basin in the center. And of course, there are many ways to do this, like a fabric that flaps in the breeze or works like a tight drum, depending on its tension. Foliage that rustles when animated by the wind, perforated walls where you have channels for the wind that becomes like a wind instrument, water that's splashing into pools or percussing onto hard surfaces, metal roofs that can sound like a drum, or rain chains that are visible and have acoustic qualities also.
So the fifth distribution, experiential sequence, arises from people moving from one condition to another, and it can happen slowly or rapidly. So this example of light and dark procession is from a museum in Denmark where the darkest subterranean level is the Egyptian exhibit, and then a luminance crescendos from the lower, darker floors through top lighted circulation to a bright, open to the sky roof terrace. And a schema in this category is ingress transitions, which is simply about moving from outdoors to in and organizing time-based zones of luminous adaptation and thermal delight along the way. And the beloved Kimball Art Museum is a classic example where thoughtfully choreographed sensory progressions facilitate this transition between the very intense outdoor compared to the restrained indoor environments. And because eyes react relatively slowly when moving from bright to dim, visual adaptation is going to require a different approach, extended time, incremental darkening. It might be expressed architecturally through longer travel distance and increasing enclosure. In contrast, thermal transitions can be intentionally abrupt and bring delight. And that is the basis of what is called allesthesia, which can be thought of as the physiological basis for thermal delight. And it's in many of our schemas. So we created this diagram for the book to illustrate this concept. The top bar represents the ambient environment. It moves from neutral in the center to more extreme cold and hot environments at the ends. The second bar is the contrast, or corrective stimulus, it's often called. And the third bar shows that the greater the difference between the ambient environment and the contrast, the greater the potential for allesthesial pleasure. Now, if you look at the pictures at the bottom, the extremes at the end are familiar to us: a hot tub on a cold night or jumping into a cool mountain river on a hot day. What we're trying to do in our schemas, though, is create moderate experiences of allesthesia in the built environment. And you can do this with contrasting conditions felt in different body parts, such as a cool breeze on your face when conditions are warm, or temporally dynamic conditions like what happens when we move between outdoors and indoors.
Finally, our last category of distributions is maybe not really a distribution of conditions itself. Narratives, they transcend sensation to require some understanding of a metaphoric or a symbolic story. In other words, we have to make sense of the feelings by interpreting them. Here's an example. This is Antoine Predoc's House for a Bird Watcher in Texas. And it illustrates a schema that we call the three realms. The idea there is that the architecture is connecting the occupants to some set of diverse natural and symbolic worlds. So on the lower left, metaphorically, one enters into the earth through these heavy stones like a cave down into the domain of the underworld. And then the ground floor opens up, as you see on the upper left, opens up to the forest with stairs that ascend to a bridge and crosses for observation. And you're in the realm of human life, that kind of thin layer on top of the earth. And then on the right, you continue along this, there's a sky ramp that leads off into the canopy of the trees, into the sky realm. And if one was to continue the whole sequence up on the top of the building, there's an enclosed roof terrace where you can't see the edges, you can only look up and contemplate the heavens. Another idea for a narrative schema we call roof terrain. And this is symbolically about revealing the process of rainwater collection and how the building interacts with water. In this project, the schema is using the roof to tell a story about how we're related to the rain. So it's deliberately shaped to collect the rainwater and direct it to storage. This allows people outside the building to imagine the flow of the catchment even on a dry day. The design guidelines in this schema's diagrams show options where the roof is not only shaped to capture the runoff, but also ways that it creates an experience where the roof shape is visible from outside the building, and if you're on the inside, from the occupied underside of that roof. So it's constantly keeping one of its roles in mind. We hope you've enjoyed this quick tour. There's about 450 pages of ideas and schemas in the work. And yet we see it's only a beginning, a way of thinking about and organizing knowledge for experiential design. And the potential is that it's open-ended and could continue to grow into hundreds of schemas. So we hope you find it both useful and inspirational. So thank you for your attention today.
Thank you, Gail and Mark. Really appreciated reading the book and turning the lovely pages and learning so much about what you guys have been digging into with your research and with your thoughts on this process. It's an incredibly important topic. I'm going to go ahead and ask a couple of questions, then we'll turn it over to the audience, because I know there's a couple of questions there now. If others have questions, please enter them into the Q&A chat, and we'll try to catch them for Gail and Mark as we move forward. Wondering, Gail and Mark, what are your thoughts on how architects can integrate these ideas into their own design process?
So I'll start with that. So I think something that we think is really important is to do it early and often. And we've developed a sort of a checklist in the book about what we call experiential programming, which is about being intentional early on about how you want occupants to feel and what the environmental conditions should be to engender those feelings. So I think people should do that before they even start designing the physical. So where and when do you want conventional, uniform, and steady state? Where do you want opportunities for spatial and temporal variability? Where you might want centralized control, but where can you provide more individual agency and adaptive opportunity to give people control over their conditions or choice to move around? So being intentional and doing it early is, I think, one of the most important ways to integrate this. Mark, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's easy when you're thinking about programming to think about the sizes of things, the basic fundamental relationships of things, the requirements and so forth, and it can become very objective. But each space, right, could have the same kinds of programming thought about its experiential qualities. You know, what do people aspire to in that space? What could you have them experience that would be way beyond working in an office or you know, cooking in a kitchen, let's say. So that's one way to think about it. I think it's a bit up in the air, right? So it's not unlike working with a knowledge base where you have to figure out which pieces of that you want, and you can't do everything. So it could be, on one hand, that you have an experiential concept for the entire project, and that becomes what helps to organize everything else. Or it could be that you're looking at a project that is organized for some other primary reasons, and then your experience becomes a modifier, right? The schemas might become modifiers of what's already organized for some other agenda.
It's occurring to me, I think that's a great answer, and it's occurring to me, Gail, especially when you talk about engaging early. I've observed often that it feels like once a designer's pencil hits the paper, it's often too late to have conversations that have depth in meeting with a client. So it's occurring to me that perhaps this is a great way to have a conversation with a client about the attributes of a site or the conditions of a particular design problem, and discuss the kinds of more evocative things that somebody would aspire to see out of the project.
You know, one other thought is that we've tried to put these into a network that kind of relates one thing to another, one schema to another, one scale to another. And so one way to approach incorporating it into a design process is to find one or two things that you seem to be interested in up front, and then look at our schemata language map and say, well, what else might be connected or related to that thing that would help to refine it? Or maybe something bigger than that schema idea, that there's a bigger idea that schema and another one help to build something larger or more significant. And so you start to get a little network of things.
Yeah, I love the idea of having conversations around those things. One more question, and then we'll go to the audience here. Curious, there's such a, in addition to the beautiful graphics and the wonderful thinking and theory that's involved, there's a heck of a lot of really great research. And in case for any readers that are looking to it, I'd like you to note that much of the research is heavily cited within the sections of the book. So if you want to dig deeper into other areas of research, this is a great resource to go to do that. And I'm wondering, what did you guys learn about gaps in the research, and where are the biggest areas where knowledge and design experience are lacking?
Well, that could be a whole hour in itself, but maybe I could take it at a really high level. And I think that some of the themes we saw, I have to say, when we started this, I thought, oh, great, every schema we have, I'm just going to fill in the research. And we discovered that it was incredibly hard to find research evidence for a lot of what we were hoping would be there. So some of the main themes that I think are really missing is that research needs to do more to enhance the positive rather than just studying how to reduce the negative. I think we need more multi-sensory research instead of just single sense research. And there are some fine researchers out there doing that. Maybe some of them are on the call and add their own comments. We do a lot of research on steady state. We need to look more at variability and transience and dynamic experience, the role of control, what happens when we actually can have adaptive opportunity and engage. How does that change our perception? Longer time frames. There's a lot of right here, right now, but how do we experience the environment over the long term? And how does that affect our well-being? And a lot of the biophilic research, most of it is about experiencing nature outdoors. And there's some and a growing amount, but not enough, of how do we experience nature inside. So those are some pretty high level themes.
Yeah, I think we also found that there was one way of looking at research in the scientific arena, which tends to necessarily simplify things, to look at single rooms or simple spaces. There's much less that's looking at sequences of spaces or some kind of complex spatial order. And so we had to say there's some things that you can find out about where we can have some controlled studies, and we can make a jump between that study and some potential experience in a building that could lead to something an architect might do. And then there was a kind of evidence that I think the discipline itself brings to bear. So you can also find patterns and typologies in the work of architects, and to say, all right, here's someone like the example that Gail showed from Wright's Winslow House, right? Here's an example of a kind of ingle nook with all kinds of manipulations of space and form to achieve a particular outcome. And that becomes evidence itself. But that said, there's a lot of holes that Gail's talked about here.
Well, thank you very much. Kira, I'll turn it over to you. I think there's some questions from the audience we should take.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. We've gotten a number of great questions, and I wanted to just lead off with one of them. Marcel Schweiker asks, do you have an estimate of how many experiential experiences people appreciate per day, and when will it be too much of a sensory stimulation, like at Disney World after a few hours? How can we find the balance?
Oh, I'd love to take that on. And hello, Marcel. And he is one of the leaders in our field of looking at multisensory response. So it's wonderful to have him here. I encourage you all to look up his publications. So Marcel, your question relates really well to a guest speaker I actually had in my class last week. I'm teaching a class on sensory space, which is based partially but not exclusively on this book. And the students, I learned so much from them. But one of the things we addressed last week, I think, is related to your question, and that's about neurodiversity, which is about how we are all on a full spectrum of what we prefer in terms of low and high intensity sensory environments, and particularly people who are neurodivergent fall at the endpoints. And so the answer to your question is really, it depends on who we are. And I am learning more and more from Kay Sargent at HOK, has done tremendous work in this area, that there are people who are hyper or hyposensitive, people who need less or more stimulation. And so the answer to the question would depend on people, but the design implications, particularly for how we design for shared spaces, is really important. And I think the key there is that we have to be able to provide both low intensity and high intensity zones and allow people to migrate through them. And particularly being careful about the high intensity zones, that those are spaces that are momentary, that people can move in and out of and have choice. So that, like you say, it doesn't feel like Disneyland. But that is an area that's that needs a lot more work. And Marcel, offline, I can send you the links to all of Kay's good work on neurodiversity, which is incredible. It relates a lot to the work you've been doing on multisensory response.
Mark, did you want to add anything to that before I go on to the next question?
I think she hit it perfectly well. Yeah.
Okay. Well, so another one that I think is really intriguing, and there are a number of intriguing questions, but Kathy Ray, I hope I'm not mispronouncing your last name, was asking a question about what we can say to the purse string holders and the conventional thinkers that want the project, every project, to move faster and be cheaper. And this is a little bit in line with something that came up a few minutes ago. We were talking about how to interact with clients and owners around these topics. And so, but I think that the crux of that question is really, how do we think about these issues in terms of value to client or stakeholders, and make sure that time is built in, and, you know, so that they appreciate the value of that. I think it's a value question.
Mark, I'm handing that one to you.
Yeah, I'm not sure that the work that we're doing here, or that the idea of taking into account the experiences of occupants or inhabitants, as I like to call them, that necessarily has a negative cost or time component to it in terms of the production of architecture. I think it's more getting your intentions in line along the way throughout the design process. For example, you know, in the building that I work in, if they had thought about these things more upfront, right, I wouldn't be working in a building which is all hard materials and no soft materials, all, you know, concrete and no wood, all noisy and no quiet, all busy and no peacefulness, no place to get away. Those kind of things could be handled in just a more thoughtful process of the same kinds of things that architects are doing. But there can be, I think, in this idea of adaptability and variability, some real opportunities for saving on operational costs and on potentially first costs for mechanical and electrical systems. So, for instance, if we make a building that has a variety of different kinds of thermal conditions in it, some of those conditions may be completely passive and unconditioned. Other ones might be just tempered slightly, and other ones might be more controlled in the conventional sense. if we give people these kinds of opportunities, and we have some schemas that are targeted towards this idea, then potentially, if you're doing good energy and bioclimatic design, you're also getting good, a wider range of positive experiences for people, which, as we know, can also bring down peak loads, can make the equipment sizing smaller, can operate for fewer hours, and so forth. And instead of this uniform environment that is the most expensive way to operate and to build a structure.
That's great. I think there's one more that's maybe a little bit of a follow-on, which has to do with how clients and architects can choose the schemas that are maybe most appropriate. It says, I wonder if Mark and Gail have thought of, or is this in the book, a list of questions for clients and architects to answer that would help them funnel down and easily select a few schemas that they can incorporate into a design? Or do you just have to read the whole book for that?
No, I would say this is not designed as a read front to back cover book. So we actually have a number of kind of navigational matrices in the beginning, so that if you're interested in light, for example, here are the schemas are related. If you're interested in water, here are schemas that are related. So that's one way to navigate through them, but it's only a partial answer to your question. I think that in talking to clients and asking them questions is like, it gets back to the experiential program. What are your intentions for the function of the space? What are your intentions for the well-being of the space? Bill Browning does a wonderful workshop, A Day in a Life. And he did it with our class for a train station. He's done it for the Portland airport. So for example, if you're trying to figure out, if your goal is to reduce stress, you do a day in the life journey of a person through that space, and where are the biggest stress points. And if you can't do everything everywhere, you start by identifying a few places that are key moments where that person can engage with the space during the day. And that's where you may invest some time and money into strategies. And so you really need to think about, I think, by starting with the user and what is their journey going to be during the day, where do they spend the most time, where they can go for a restorative experience, and that's where you can prioritize.
Wonderful. I think we are out of time. Thank you both so much. And thank you, Bob, for your great questions and your amazing review. And AIA San Francisco, COTE, Annabelle, everyone. And thank you so much for everyone for joining.